There's been a lot of grazing issues in the news lately in regards to sagebrush ecosystem and restoration and improvements. So with that, we have probably our state's best of the best up here on this panel. They didn't even pay me to say that. No, I'm very thankful to get to work with these folks on a very frequent basis, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you guys introduce yourselves. I can read your bios, but that's boring. So I'm going to have you guys introduce yourselves, and I would like for you to then highlight what your involvement is with livestock grazing and ecosystem management in Nevada, so that everybody can get a sense of what your background is. So Brad, can we start with you?
Sure.
Are we missing somebody?
No, this
Oh,
oh,
that was this morning, sorry.
Sorry.
This is it.
Okay, as you can see, these guys are not fun to be around at all, so just bear with us, okay? Go ahead, Brad.
My name's Brad Schultz, and my name's Brad Schultz, and I'm with the University of Nevada Cooperative Extension in Winnemucca. I've been with Extension for about 14 years now. I've been working across the sagebrush region from northeastern California all across Nevada since 1981. When I was an undergraduate at UC Davis, came to Nevada in '84 as a graduate student, and I've worked my way around the state at some point in time in just about every place in the sagebrush zone. Often dealing with livestock grazing. I work a lot with noxious weeds, public land grazing issues. I'm part of the Cooperative Extension's Nevada Range Management School, where I teach the section on plant growth, physiology, development, and how it interacts with livestock grazing. Been involved with the sage grouse issue at the local planning level since 2001. I like to work on all the non-minerals.
Okay, I'm Tamzen Stringham, and we'll get it out of the way up front. I am a direct descendant of the Donner family. Tamzen Donner was one of my great-great-great-great-grandparents. So, that said, I survived, they didn't. You don't want to have lunch with me, because I will get out alive. So let's see, I was raised over the hill here in Grass Valley, California, on a small ranching operation where we raised registered Angus cattle. And I did my coursework at Chico State and then at Oregon State, and I taught for 15 years at Oregon State in the range program there. And then came here in 2008. I am a rangeland ecologist. I have been around the block with the Endangered Species Act and endangered species up in Oregon, where they have listed just about every fish you want to swim up a river. And so, been there, done that, understand what that does to the livestock industry, and have worked closely in resolving a lot of those issues in cooperative agreements with the agencies and landowners and livestock producers in Oregon, and now we're going to face some of those issues here. And so there are ways to solve it, and there are ways to make it work for everybody in a win-win situation, and we can get it done. And so now I'm in Nevada. I travel a lot. I do a lot of research on various aspects of rangelands, including grazing.
We'll share. My name is Perryman. I'm a professor of rangeland ecology at the University of Nevada, Reno. I've been in Reno now for just about 15 years. Before that, I was at the University of Wyoming on the faculty down there for about 10 years. I grew up on a little outfit in Texas. I still have a little bit of that accent. But I escaped as quickly as I could and made it out to the free countries of Wyoming and Montana and Nevada. So I've been kicking around the West for a long time. Grew up mashing cows and lots of other things. I was telling somebody the other day I started paying Social Security when I was 11. And that's because it was easier to work for somebody else besides working at home. So I left home at the age of 11 and went to work for somebody else because it was easier to work. But anyway, I'll digress and kill all the time here if we don't watch it. But I've done research on quite a number of things, everything from sage grouse nutrition and fitness, the mineland reclamation, and what I've been involved in most of the time here in the last 3 or 4 years is cheatgrass. And how can we utilize cheatgrass, better utilize cheatgrass, and what's causing all these cheatgrass explosions in the United States. When you go over to Central Asia, sort of its ancestral homeland, and it's well behaved over there, and the only place you can find it's under a shrub that some critter can't get his nose under to get. So that's been kind of interesting the last few years, and most of you here probably have seen me around the state once or twice for that time period. So I'll pass this along to Ron Torell.
And certainly good afternoon to everyone. If I have not had a chance to shake the hands of some of my old friends, it looks like a homecoming. With that said, I feel privileged to be sitting next to these 3 individuals up here. They are my past co-workers. For 26 years, I served as the livestock specialist for Nevada. My passion and love has always been and always will be the production and marketing of beef cattle, in particular reproductive management of the beef cattle. I do have a range management minor, and work with these 3 individuals up here. And I'd say certainly you're probably going to hear the same story from each one of us, because the 4 of us have sat around the campfire and we've discussed the issues that we're about to talk about. And I'd say almost with confidence that we're in total agreement on the problems, but certainly we do not come at a pass for a solution. So that's what we need to come up with. Thank you. I'm representing the Nevada Cattlemen Association, by the way.
Very good, thank you guys. So we sent our moderators some predetermined questions, or our panelists some predetermined questions, and I'm probably not the best moderator because I don't follow instructions very well. So I don't bake, I cook, I can't bake because you have to follow instructions. So I'm going to kind of deviate from the first question that we had for them. The question was around, what do you identify as the top 3 issues?
That's only one I had an answer for.
Well, it's okay, we're still going to do it. But I have a feeling, like Ron said, I'm going to ask you the top 3 issues, and they're going to be the same top 3 issues for you, and vice versa. So, from the panel, and
We just will get that out of the way. Cheatgrass, wild horses, and wildfire. And throw in water and social aspects.
thanks, folks, back it up. No, and that's true, right? So those are our issues, and I want to add Medusa head in there because that's just personally a vendetta for me. But yeah. So anyway, so if you kind of expand on those, we know those are the issues because we're hearing it over and over. We're looking at sage grouse plans and things like that, and we're seeing these 4, actually not 3, 4 or 5 issues that are the same. So from your scientific perspective, what are some of the avenues towards progress that we can look at in getting away from these being such large issues? And maybe we want to start with, the benefits of grazing. Do we want to start there, and then I'll move down?
Benefits of grazing. You're throwing me a curveball here, because I actually just looked at the email that told me these questions that were coming at 11 o'clock. And I wrote some answers down here, and now you changed the game on me.
Yep.
Well, the vegetation on our rangelands provides habitat for wildlife, stability for soils, and forage for animals. So we can use grazing to manipulate vegetation to benefit all of those. And it's not whether or not you graze something, but how. It's the nuts and bolts. And we can reduce fuels. We can increase certain plants. We can use grazing to increase shrubs. There's a very good review paper that came out recently on sagebrush and talks about several aspects of how grazing can actually be used to increase sagebrush. That's important on a lot of our rangelands and so forth. Properly managed grazing can help stabilize soils. Increasing our bunch grasses out there with the dense fibrous root systems are the best vegetation out there for keeping soil in place, keeping nutrients on the landscape, keeping annual grasses from invading a lot of areas. There's infrastructure associated with grazing. The home ranches, the home property has probably dramatically increased our summer habitat for a lot of wildlife, particularly at lower elevations. Most of those areas dried up in the past. They now stay green much longer into the summer, into the fall, providing habitat that never existed for everything from mule deer to antelope to sage grouse. And I probably ought to give someone else a chance to speak.
I think Brad covered a lot of the ways, the big picture ways grazing can be a positive. So I'm going to focus on some of the more specific ways grazing can be positive. So let's talk about fuels for a minute. There was a very good paper done out of the ARS Burns Oregon lab on long-term exposures. We're talking 70 years of excluding livestock from grazing and then allowing some of those areas to be grazed moderately. So we're talking 30 to 50% removal of biomass and some that were not grazed, and then they applied fire to those systems and looked at the response. Okay, so some of the things you learned from that is what is the response of the bunchgrass community to that fire. So the areas that were not grazed had greater pine fuels within the bunchgrass plant itself. Those plants died with fire, greater than the ones that were grazed moderately. When those plants die, it opens up the system for cheatgrass invasion. And so there was greater cheatgrass present in the areas that had not been grazed after fire than the ones that had been grazed. So one of the lessons we can learn from that is appropriate grazing reduces the fuel buildup in our bunchgrass community so that when it does burn, the fire is not as damaging to that system than areas that have a lot of fuel buildup in them. And when those areas that do burn with a lot of fuel buildup in them, they tend to convert to cheatgrass more easily than areas that have been appropriately grazed. I think that is tools that we need to learn, that grazing is not just grazing. There's ways to graze appropriately. Grazing will not necessarily stop fire. Grazing changes the way fire behaves and the way the post-fire plant community responds to that fire. And those are lessons we need to learn out there. It changes continuity of fuels, how fire moves across the landscape. Those are lessons we have to apply in our management of our rangelands. We're no longer able to ignore the impact of fire in Nevada or other places in the Great Basin. Okay? You have
I
your
think
own.
this was working, didn't it?
Yeah.
I'll just sort of elaborate maybe a little bit more on what my colleagues have said here. There's an ecological term called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which means that if an area is disturbed intermediately, that there are, and intermediately in time and in intensity, there are benefits that accrue from that. For instance, most areas that, and we did a little exposure study about 10 or 12 years ago on the Nevada plots, which were plots that were about 65 years old at the time. And what you find generally in these exposure types of studies, grazing exposure type studies, is that areas that are grazed typically, because of this intermediate disturbance hypothesis, typically they have greater diversity, plant community diversity, and that we tend to think about those things about that as being a good thing. When it comes to plant decadence, we know about wolfy plants. That's what Tamzen was talking about. You get a wolfy plant that's got a lot of dead material on it that'll burn. It's going to be a lot hotter right there when the fire comes than if it's a green plant that doesn't have a lot of fuels built up in that crown area. So there's some direct things that accrue from moderate grazing. And of course, when we talk about grazing, this is one of my pet peeves. When we talk about grazing, and you see this in the ecological literature, they'll talk about grazing, but grazing has three components: time, intensity, and duration. And if you don't address those three things, you're just wasting everybody's time. And I get tired of people just using this term grazing and not really getting down to the meat of, well, what kind of grazing? When are you going to graze it? And those kinds of questions that go along with it. One of the things that we've been working on recently kind of has to do with one of the challenges that I would have brought up if the first question would have been asked. And that is with annual grasses, with cheatgrass. What the science is telling us now is that the more litter, the more fuels you leave on the ground with cheatgrass, the more cheatgrass you're going to have over the long term. Okay, so grazing those annual fuels down does appear to be, appear to be somewhat of a control method for cheatgrass. Now that leads you into this challenge where the land management agencies don't even recognize annual grasses as a forage. It's not even calculated. It's not a part of the grazing management plans. And yet, like this year, in a lot of areas, we had between 400 and maybe 600 pounds of cheatgrass to the acre in a lot of areas, and it's not even accounted for. How? I mean, that's 400 or 500 pounds of fuel that's going to be carried over to next year's fuel fire season. So why can't we account for those things? There has to be a mechanism within NEPA and within the allotment planning process or the permit renewal process that accounts for those things with annual grasses. So, Ron.
I'd like for you to open your mind for just a minute because, as I mentioned, my passion is beef cattle production. Let's stop and think about this for a minute. We talked about the problem. The problem is, getting this sound science practiced on the ground to better our land. But with that said, let's go back to the cause. After a year, well, actually 10 years of working in the officers lineup of the Nevada Cattlemen Association, and after the past years of dealing with the political side of public lands grazing, I can tell you that let's go back to the cause. And I'll tell you what I think the cause is I think that the cause is that we've evolved to a point where we've got a very disconnected public. We've got a public that does not understand agriculture. We've got a public, everyone in this room that ate lunch has a full stomach. We're well fed, we're well clothed. We're spoiled, rotten brats is what we are. I talked to my grandfather before he died, and he went through the Depression, and my dad, many of your dads fought in World War II, and those that weren't fighting in World War II were at home producing food and fiber for those that were overseas. My mom tells me, she's 87 years old, and she tells me that in the 50s, when I was born in 1955, the American public held those of us in agriculture to the highest esteem, those that produced food and fiber. And agriculture was king. Agriculture was king through my high school years in 1970. And then we started getting into the next generations that were well fed and well clothed and spoiled. And now we're into another generation. And I'm not throwing stones at you young ladies. I sat in on the last session and talked about social media. Well, social media, I've heard the positives about it. I saw what the negatives are when you deal with the wild horse advocates and how they misuse the information and put it out there of how these poor starving horses, when in reality it's the horses that are beating up our rangelands and preventing us from moving our program forward. I'm just about to fall off my soapbox, so I'll pass it on. But I wanted to give you that different perspective of public lands grazing from the way I see it in the chair that I've been sitting in for the last year with the Nevada Cattlemen Association, calling on my background and my education.
I think that was a good summary to all of the issues that we're dealing with, right? It's not just one issue, it's not just horses, it's not just drought, it's not just the media, it's not just an uneducated public, it's a very, very complicated web of influences that are influencing the grazing decisions that are being made at our federal agencies. What I'd like to know is if you could speak to producers and give them some advice on how grazing can be utilized beneficially for ecological restoration. What are some of the keys, some of the things that we have to do right as producers? We kind of talked about them at a 30,000 foot level, but kind of, Tamzen and I had a little discussion very briefly just to warn her. how are we transferring your guys' research and the good research out there about using grazing for ecological restoration? How are we transferring that from your desk or your plots to our producers? What are some things that we need to know? How's that for a curveball?
Am I answering this?
No, any of you can, but
I go first.
I think you guys are doing a good job without a lot of coaxing, so you go for it.
Okay, so there's 3 keys I think that you have to work with. I do a lot of outreach, even though I'm not extension. I work with Brad, work with other extension people. I know Barry does the same. And I did this in Oregon also. And there's 3 keys I think that you have to have when you work with public land, grazing, people who make their living utilizing public lands. When the players come to the table, you have to start with it has to be economically, ecologically, and socially sustainable. Period. If it's not economically sustainable for the livestock producer, it will fail. You cannot ask him to lose money to implement whatever plan is on the table. Period. So you have to understand the economics of the ranch. I have 2 degrees in economics. I understand economics. He cannot lose money. Secondly, it has to be ecologically sustainable. The land management agency cannot afford to degrade the land. The rancher cannot afford to degrade the land because that's where the grass grows that feeds the cow and makes the cow fat, that makes him money. It's also where the wildlife habitat is, that is ecologically creates the balance that makes the social network happy. So everything has to work. Is it difficult? Yeah. I'm going to tell you it's easy. Okay? So you have to have those 3, it's a 3-legged stool. You cut one of those legs off, stool falls over. So all 3 of those have to be in place. And part of that socially sustainable component is to make sure that 5th generation ranch kid has a ranch. It's not just to make sure the CR Club's happy. Okay? So with that in mind, then, you can begin the process of taking the research we do, taking the management that the ranch manager or owner understands, and coming up with a plan that is ecologically stable for that piece of ground. Our research, Barry's research, is not plot level, only applied at the plot level. It has to go outside the plot and apply at landscape scales. So is there an art to range management? Absolutely, there's an art to range management. But we cannot afford also to take the research that we do, say that Barry's doing maybe on grazing cheatgrass, and just do a broad brush application and say it's going to work everywhere. That's why when Barry says, when we talk about grazing, that you have to understand timing, intensity, and duration, those are things that have to be discussed in the grazing management application of whatever our research is. So when we talk to ranch, when I talk to the cowboys, the guys who actually run the cows may not be the ranch manager. Might be the guy who's out there on the horse. We're going to go out and we're going to talk about bunch grasses. Does he need to know that that's blue bunch wheatgrass? Or that that's Thurber's needlegrass? Or that that's Indian rice grass? Probably not. But he needs to know that if you graze it below this level, it's time to move the cows. That's pretty simple. We can talk about those things. You don't have to talk about p-values and statistical competence. So the scientist can stay home, okay? But we can take the knowledge we have from science and we can apply it at a level that's meaningful to that grass plant. I'm done.
There's a couple things I think we always need to keep in mind. There is not a plant out there that cares about the welfare of any animal it raised. There is not an animal out there that cares about the welfare of any plant it grazes. They're both very selfish. We, as managers, are the only ones that actually care about the welfare of both of those entities. And if you care about the welfare of the plant and manage to maintain the health and vigor and productivity of those perennial bunch grasses, they will ultimately take care of your animal. And if you manage the animal to maintain its economic productivity, its health, its ability to reproduce, while maintaining the plant, that should, most of the time, if you make other good decisions, take care of the economics. And we need to remember that every problem, science is at best probably only 49% of the solution. Because every problem works in a social, political, cultural, and economic context. And those issues are much harder to usually overcome than the actual science. Because they're often based on values that are deeply held, often ingrained multi-generations, and that's a much harder area to work in than the actual science.
That's a great segue into what I wanted to say. I've learned over the years that if you're going to affect policy within land management agencies, and it's one thing, I want to take it to another level of stratification. It's one thing to have a new scientific application to bring to producers. It's another thing for public lands producers to get the federal agencies to recognize it. Okay, those are two different things. And it doesn't matter if it's the best science in the world, if it's not adopted as policy by the land managers, then it never gets implemented. It's kind of like McDonald's. McDonald's, they haven't sold 1 billion hamburgers because they made a really good one, I guess is the way to say it. But it's marketing. It's merchandising is what it is. And so what I've learned is over the years is that if you're going to affect policy within the federal agencies, their land management policies, the way you go about doing it is that the new knowledge that you create, if you're going to affect that change, it has to be, it's like killing the king. It has to be in public and it has to be bloody. And I've been going all over the West for the last 4 or 5 years saying that about this fall grazing cheatgrass issue. In the past, people say, well, no, animals won't eat it. Well, we know better than that. Anybody that's been out there and looked around, we know they'll eat it. It can be very nutritious, and it's a nice tool. It's working its way to the point where it's going to be a nice tool, I think, for fuels reduction. But to try and get public policy engaged to the point where they say, okay, let's try this, let's do it, is something that's difficult. And the only way you can do that is you have to make that new knowledge have so much gravitational pull that it can't be ignored by policymakers in Washington or at the state level, depending on where your issue is. And so I think that's, you go up a level in stratification, but I think that's where we're at right now. We already know a lot of neat stuff. We know what to do in a lot of cases, but we can't do it because some kind of policy is in the way. And we've got to get better at trying to figure out how to make those changes in policy. And I'll let you run with that one.
Once again, I'd like to offer you a little different perspective. Adoption of technology, range management issues to better our land. Consider this, in 1965, I worked for Ira Boyce, they're near contact, weaned 375-pound calves. The heaviest calves they'd weaned in years and years and years, and they held them over as yearlings. And they had about a 75% calf pregnancy rate, strung out over 150 days. Through technology, could you live with that same cow and that same management today? No, to the livestock industry's benefit, in a desert range environment, in a dry state in the nation, it's common to hit 90–94% conception. It's common to wean calves that are 500 pounds plus. It's common to get those cows bred up in a 60-day breeding period because of adoption of technology. With that said, for over 26 years, I was the guy in charge of Cattlemen's Update. We always put the majority of the subject matter, production, marketing, and nutrition, because that's what got cattlemen to turn out. They were hungry for that technology. Now, range science technology, range management technology, it was growing at the same rate, thanks largely to our land-grant university systems. But the people wouldn't show up to listen to it. So my point being is that we can no longer continue to do range management the way Grandpa did it. And we have people in our industry that are stuck on that. It's worked in the past, and so it's business as usual. We've got to become better range managers. We're good cow managers. We're good at reproduction. We're good at nutrition. We're good at all these other factors. But when it comes to range management, my personal score is a C for the industry in Nevada. We need to be better at educating ourselves on the principles that these folks out here research and teach.
Ron, I'm going to stick with you for a second, and kind of, you guys are moving right in the direction of questions. I don't know if it's because you've read them before and you've seen them, or, but one of the things that we're lacking is being able to communicate with those outside of agriculture about what we do well, what we do right, and the benefits that livestock grazing can have in our state. How do you propose that we do a better job at that?
That's for these kids right up here. I said, in on this social media stuff, and I'll tell you, this social media stuff, that's where I get off and I pass the ball to you guys. Because I'm not going to get on Twitter and I'm not going to get on Facebook, but I recognize the positives as well as the negatives. That's the way we reach the general masses. I mean, my gosh, look at these horse advocates, how they get a negative message across. Your generation has to step up to the plate, and we will support you, but you've got to do that. The other thing is that we as an industry have got to do a better job of holding up our success stories. We've got to take our success stories and hold them up to the world. Look what we're doing. How many of you have read the recent Progressive Rancher, this last issue? Did you read about Maggie Creek Ranch, John Griggs? That is a success story, folks. We've got to hold those up. We've got to strive. We've got to take a chapter out of that book and move that forward. That's not to say that there isn't a lot of people in the room and a lot of people in the industry that are doing great things, but to take a book out of Hudson Klimt's quote, do a little and brag a lot. That's exactly what we have to do, is do a little and brag a lot. Brag about the good and clean up the bad.
Yes. A couple of things. One reason public policy is so influenced by, in a lot of cases, by people who have a different idea about agriculture is because the public, I think, through ignorance and through apathy, and a combination of those two things at times, allows it to happen. And the reason why the public, I think, allows it to happen is because we don't have good education, agriculture education, in our K through 12 schools. And in order to do that, you have to have a curriculum. Why not have an agriculture curriculum for biology? An agriculture-based curriculum for biology K through 12. As opposed to oceans. Oceans are cool, but maybe there's a better model to use there. So there's two things. First of all, you have to develop a K through 12 curriculum, and that's agriculture-based, and then you have to get different states to adopt them in their textbooks. And so I think that's that's something that's been kind of rolling around the back of my mind the last few years, is how to go about doing it. I don't have any answers, but if you have a generation of students K through 12 that are educated as to where their food comes from, so other students besides just our FFA students know where their food comes from, now you have the ability to maybe affect some policy that might be beneficial to the industry and to the human race in general.
I'm not sure I have anything to add to this discussion. This has been a conversation that I have heard go on for over a decade in the ag community. How do we get our message out? How do we get urban population understand this better. And we are still having that discussion, which tells me that we have not done well in getting that message out. So I do think it's probably the younger generation, not my generation, that's going to lead that charge. I do want to give a little bit of positive hope in that I'm seeing a different attitude in the classroom with college students than I was seeing 10 years ago. In that I have a lot of urban students in my classes, and they are much more friendly towards ag and friendly towards the range management profession than they were 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they were there to stop livestock grazing. Now they're there to understand livestock grazing. So there is a change. Those are the people who go to work for BLM. Remember that.
I probably don't have any real solutions, but I think some of the sideboards on the approach is, if you want to get a message across, you have to make it personal to someone. People make decisions because it's in their interest, not because you think they should. So it has to be personal and pertinent. In today's world, people have short attention spans, so it has to be quick, short, and direct, and clear. And visual seems to go across much better than printed media anymore. So that's probably the delivery mechanisms. I have learned through an experience this past year, there are ways roads we do not want to go down to make it pertinent to people. I spent 2 weeks in the Republic of Georgia back in July, and that's a country that went through complete and total economic collapse in 1989 when the Russians left. Every resource that was in that country was provided by the Russians, and everybody overnight went back to subsistence agriculture just to survive. If you lived in the Republic of Georgia right now, every one of you would own one cow. You'd keep it in your backyard, and you would turn it loose in the morning to roam the city streets to find whatever it could to eat, so that you could make enough cheese so your kids could have some food in the wintertime. And where the cow wasn't pinned up, you grew potatoes, grapes, tomatoes or something, so that you would have some food. That's not a path we ever want to go down. And that's a country that has some real grazing issues, because it's the size of South Carolina, and it has 1 million cows roaming its streets. And every one of them is a milk cow. And you know they got too many, and you're sitting there trying to teach them grazing management. And when everybody has only one cow, who do you tell has to give theirs up? Look them in their eye and see that. It's quite an experience to go through, and it's a real eye-opener. So we need to find a way to make agriculture more pertinent, so we don't end up going down that road at some point in time because of situations that occur outside of our control.
I got one comment, Gina. Actually, I'd like to relay a message to you from my mom, 87 years old, my aunt, 85 years old. We had this discussion and just BSing, and their solution to the problem, they said, Ronnie, they called me Ronnie, that's the mom's name, you know. Ronnie, that's nothing that a good depression would not solve. And that's exactly right. If we had another depression like we did in the, before World War II, in the 20s and the 30s, people got hungry, all of a sudden, agriculture would be king again. And I hate to resort to that because I didn't live through it. That might be what it takes to turn the American public around with depression.
I think that's scary but true. Where's it at, Terry?
So I was just gonna say, I wrote an article in Range Magazine a couple of years ago on that very subject. Absolutely, just that very subject, and people were hungry. And I would hate to see it get to that point where people are really hungry. I don't mean they missed a meal or two. I mean, they missed several meals, and I hope it doesn't get to that point, but there is a latent effect from that, because I say I was born in the 50s, but I was raised in the 30s. Nobody told my family that the Depression was over. So there was some latent effects from it, and I still recognize that. So anyway.
Thank you, guys. So we're going to go to questions. I say 15 minutes for questions while we have all these guys in the room. While you think about your question, and we think about how much we need to educate our young folks about agriculture. I'm thinking of Jamie Greer, who works with me, went to the Boys and Girls Club, was showing them the different animals on the farm and asked them, this is a cow and what does it eat? And this little gal goes, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. It was cute for a minute, right? Until we realized this is the future of America and we need to educate them. So I just thought it was cute but really sad at the same time. So I got a question back here.
Yeah, Ron, I want to go on what you were talking about, getting the youth motivated to fight for our rights. But me being 32 years old, right in that mixed generation of the younger generation not caring at all, don't want to fight for anything, but your generation, my dad's generation, of you fight for every damn thing you get. How can we get those younger generations motivated to go and be activists for agriculture?
John, that's a good question, and I don't know, as you're well aware, we made a real strong effort to get young cattlemen to our convention, the Nevada Cattle Association convention last week, and obviously there's some young folks here. And I think it stems back, you know, it's a generational gap. These kids' generations are 3 generations out from my mother, and you're far removed from hard times. I mean, that's not to say we don't all have hard times, but somehow we've got to get that generation to realize that we need them to step up to the plate and to swing for us in the social media and the other aspects. So I don't have an answer for you, John, but I appreciate you presenting the question because it's a real issue.
I'm going to go to this gentleman back here, but while I do, if maybe, I was just going to say if some of our FFA folks have some input on this, if you guys don't mind. Did you have a question or do you have input? Okay, so if you guys from FFA want to maybe think about some guidance for us old folks and what we can do to bring the younger generation along, raise your hand when we're done and we'll come to you.
I listened to our panel from an educational and a scientific background, and I agree with what's being said. Then I go home and listen to my range con. It comes from the same educational, scientific background. Why the huge discrepancy?
I give that to somebody else to talk about.
You've got to remember the bureaucracy they work for, and there's policies that come out of DC that filter down to state level, down to a district level, and then eventually to the poor guy who's under those 3 rocks. And I'm not going to defend all of them, because if you look at any workforce, you got a bell curve. You got most of them in the middle, some really great ones, and a few really poor ones. And it doesn't matter if it's ranching, farming, manufacturing, that's the structure of the workforce, of the quality of the people. There's a lot of good people out there, but they're beat down and they realize they want to make a career, and after a while they just kind of go along with the flow. I'm kind of privileged in extension. I get to hide behind the science. My mandate is to bring that forward. Their mandate is to implement a policy they had absolutely nothing to do with deriving. But they have no choice but to implement it. Some implement it much better than others. And I think that's where one of the real issues is the quality of that implementation and how we can work to improve that. The one thing I've learned over time is you have to separate the individual that works for the BLM from BLM bureaucracy. And if you treat an individual well, generally you can work with them much better, and they're willing to go out on more limbs and try to, for lack of a better term, get away with more. It's not really what it is, but we use that term, and be a lot more flexible. There are exceptions. There are just hard rocks out there that are tough to deal with.
Yeah, it's a good question. You have to remember, and I'm not defending anybody, I'm just stating it as an observation of mine. There's very little to no incentive for a federal employee to take a risk. But there's all kinds of incentive for them to not take a risk. and they're young, they're starting out in their career, and there you go. They have policies that they have to adhere to. They've got administrators that they have to answer to, and maybe we need more range folks up in higher administration within some of the federal agencies, possibly. Maybe that would make a difference. I don't know, but that's just an observation of mine.
Stringham, Tamzen, unless you have something to add to comment. I think JJ's best said it in the session before lunch when he said we got to go to Washington. We got to change the mandates that are passed down to those individuals at the ground level. And your range con is being given directives to follow, and those are coming from Washington, D.C. all the way down. Somehow we've got to get that train derailed and base our range management decisions on science and sound management.
I'm going to go to the gentleman in the back and then to Sherm.
I'm Blake Duncan, I'm undergrad in state agency for 4-H, and if you'd like, I can elaborate, coming from my point of view, on the topic of how to deal with generation involved.
Please. Here, do you want this? We want to hear from you.
Yeah.
I hope everybody can hear me. First and foremost, I'll admit it now, I have a cell phone, I watch TV, and the one thing I hope the older generation can learn from us is that, Brad said it perfectly, we have a short attention span. If you go to his office, there is probably half a dozen noxious weed reports that you know. I know that because I look at the table and I turn to my left. And right by the door, there is just a poster, and it has probably 5 facts on how to spray noxious weeds and what you should and shouldn't do. I have never read one of those reports, but I've probably read that poster at least a dozen times. Wear long sleeves, right there, Okay. I'm not gonna read, why this plant does this and how it doesn't, no offense. And the other point I'd like to make is, I'm 18. I'm the young generation, I'm, young, dumb, and I think I know it all. The panel up there, no offense, you look a little older than I do. And I think I know it all, but you actually do. You have the experience. So to bridge this gap between us, I hope you realize that it'll take me to learn from you, but I hope you also have to learn from us and show us the way. I think I know everything about range, and ecology, and the Cattlemen's convention I attended last weekend opened my eyes. And we can see that you've tried with PBS. They have documentaries of JJ here, and I've watched them. I may have fell asleep during it. And I hope you realize that if you take a step towards us, we'll take a step towards you. And even though there's only maybe a dozen of us young members here, if we can get all the input from each and every one here who is older than us, and that can, if Ron here and this whole panel can guide one, this dozen here has the input from a generation older. And I also like to throw out the comment that, remember, you were our age one time? And I have to tell that to my mother a lot, but you're 18 as well. And she says, I'm trying to help you through my mistakes, so would you help us through your mistakes and show us the way so we can do it better, and then we'll teach you about Twitter.
Yes. Good luck, Sherm. That's tough.
So, doing a little back of the envelope math, I think there's a century of experience in Great Basin rangeland management up on the stage. And the actual theme of this session, I think, is using grazing management for ecosystem management. And so what I'd like to ask the panelists is for their best success story that they've observed on these rangelands in the Great Basin, that if we did more of that elsewhere in the Great Basin, we would see better rangeland ecosystems.
Excellent, thank you.
Who wants to start? I'll give my 5 cents first. I grew up on the Knoll Creek Experiment Station, which is located on the Salmon River Cattlemen's Association, which is a conglomerate of farmers from southern Idaho that run their cattle down in that area. Born and raised there in 1955, and I watched the Columbus grazing system practice. In other words, you turn your cattle out in the spring and you go discover them in the fall. Growing up in that area, I didn't know that there was any other way of doing business. Due to a larkspur problem, larkspur is a poisonous plant in the higher elevations that kill cattle. They put in a fence along the base of the mountain and allowed them to have a deferred grazing system. That was for the larkspur problem because it was killing cattle, but it turned out to have tremendous benefit for the rangelands. We had a family reunion up there a few years ago. They split that property up into several other fences and had a rotational grazing system. That's how technology evolved. That country looks better than it ever did as I was growing up, and it was because of a few basic implementations of range management practices of rest rotation grazing. Had it not been for larkspur, we would have not implemented that technology, but because of larkspur, it led to great range management and benefit on the land. And when you get down to it, that's what we're all about, is stewardships and bettering the land.
A specific example, I think, is some of the effects that we've seen on the perennial plant community, where we've been grazing cheatgrass, where we've been reducing fuels in the fall. With the right combination of weather variables, the results, well, I don't use the word amazing very often in a sentence, but it's pretty doggone good. I think there's as much upside to this new little piece of technology as anything I've done in the last 20 years.
Okay, I'll try to keep this really short, but I probably won't. So a big ranch in southeast Oregon, Great Basin Ranch, was going to lose their allotments due to poor grazing management on riparian systems, had threatened species in their creeks, and I got a phone call, said, can you come help us with our riparian grazing management? They just hired a new ranch manager. So I got there, and we spent about a week looking at creeks and came up with some grazing changes that included a lot of riding, salting off the creeks, providing supplement off the creeks, and also some upland management. They had a lot of they had a lot of western juniper issues and some other problems on their upland systems. And over a course of 10 years, we're not talking instant fixes here, guys. A course of 10 years with fencing, grazing changes, hiring cowboys to ride and move cows, changing the type of livestock they were running. Cows that don't want to rest in the bottom, but will actually climb hills. And some upland management. They won a national award for conservation. And I had the privilege of escorting an assistant director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service around their ranch, who stood at the fence line and said, why can't BLM manage their lands as well? So that's one success. That ranch is nationally renowned for raising sage grouse, and for raising sandhill cranes, and for raising mule deer and elk that are massive in size. So that was one. I still get to go visit there. They also helped me educate 3 PhD students and 5 master students on projects on their property. The next one is Smith Creek Ranch here in Nevada. That is part of the Desatoya project that Amy Luters alluded to earlier today. And that ranch is, they've won a National Conservation Award for their management. We are, UNR and many other partners, ARS, are greatly involved on that ranch on research projects currently looking at the use of water by pinyon and juniper and the impacts that has on meadow hydrology, sage-grouse habitat, mule deer habitat, and forage. And I can give you a little bit of numbers that are coming off of there right now. We know that pinyon juniper canopies on average intercept 44% of the incoming rainfall. That's a lot of water when you're in a 12-inch precip zone. You can do the math. We also know from work that Dr. Keir Snyder has done that a 12-inch diameter tree is using about 158 gallons of water per month. So depending on the number of trees you have per acre, you can figure out how much water they're sucking out of the ground. We don't know what the replacement vegetation is of sagebrush is using yet, but she has sagebrush instrumented, and we'll have numbers on that next year. So if we take the trees out, how much water will the sagebrush use? We can net out what the net response will be, if any. So we're beginning to understand the water balance of these systems. Drought is an issue. Water is an issue in this state. And it isn't just that we're not getting snow. That's one type of drought. It's what are the trees? Do you guys realize that we have over 18 million hectares of trees in the Great Basin that we did not have in 1860? Do you realize that? They're growing in sagebrush grounds. When we talk about sage grouse habitat, sage grouse don't like trees. So if we have 18 million hectares that we didn't have, if you guys think in acres, you can take a hectare and multiply it by 2.5, and that will give you acres. Okay, that's a lot of acres of trees that sage grouse no longer use. Think of it that way. And then think about how much water they're using. Okay? So those things all impact rangelands. And Smith Creek Ranch has been a great partner in allowing us access to their property and allowing us to play in the world of research to figure some of these things out.
I think I'll give 2 examples here. I mentioned the range management school that we teach in Cooperative Extension. And I've seen it happen a couple of times now on grazing allotments, on Forest Service primarily, but also some BLM. But one time in particular, I saw a permittee able to use the scientific language we were able to teach him and communicate and win an argument with Katy Fight and Western Watersheds, and get backed up by the Forest Service because he was able to talk their language to them equally as well as they could, and get their support in some grazing management decisions in the Santa Rosas. So while often the language is technical, there is often a lot of value in everybody learning some of it, because when you can communicate with it to others, they're just going to accept you a little bit more, think you're a little bit more knowledgeable, a little bit more understanding, and it just kind of goes with the flow that way. And then I spent a lot of time working on noxious weeds on the private lands, the native grass hay meadows that are a critical component of our livestock grazing systems. And spent a lot of time working with Darrell Reisgard over here in the Paradise Valley Weed Control District. When I first got there in 2001, there might have been 1, maybe 2 landowners in that valley that had any kind of weed control program. And after about 10 or 12 years of working with them, slowly finding ways to convince them that it's in their interest to address their weed issues, everybody in that valley had some level of noxious weed control on their property. And I found that quite rewarding, and I think a very significant success.
So I have to apologize, there was a couple people I didn't get to with their questions because we're out of time. But I wanted to thank you for that closing question, Sherm, that was good. And thank you to the gentleman from Winnemucca. I think we have some homework. I think we have some homework to go out and reach out to somebody a little bit younger than us so that we can learn from them and then we can tell them about all of our mistakes. I think that was probably the best advice I've heard today. So I really appreciate that. And I want to thank our panel. You guys, I know these last couple months and always are zipping everywhere around the state and then some other countries. So to make time for us and help us out today, I want to thank you guys. If you guys would give them a big round of applause.